Good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne Stanis, the Vice President of Education for Indiana Landmarks, and I want to welcome our in-person audience as well as the over 200 people that are joining us online tonight. So for those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of the screen if you want to ask a question, and then at the end of the talk, we will take questions from the live audience and Zoom audience as time permits. And we want to remind you to check out upcoming events, including Conversations in Indiana African American History and Culture. That's on October 17th. And an Indiana Freedom Trail Symposium on October 18th. The Italianate and Second Empire Architecture Talk by Jim Glass will be on November 7th. And our annual holiday church tour is on December 7th. This year it's featuring houses of worship in Irvington. And I want to thank our sponsors, the Cornelius O'Brien Lecture Series concerning historic preservation and the Penrod Society for allowing you to bring us this talk tonight at no charge. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fraternal orders proliferated across the United States, and lodges built by Masons, Oddfellows, Elks, and other orders became important community landmarks. You can't drive through a large city or a rural crossroad without seeing one, if not more, of these tangible legacies of the organizations. And today, participation in fraternal organizations is on a decline. As numbers dwindle, more lodges have disbanded or vacated aging outsized facilities, leaving significant buildings at risk. Since including lodges on last year's 10 Most Endangered list, Indiana Landmarks helped save previously threatened lodge buildings in Vernon, North Vernon, and Bedford, but other sites remain imperiled, including Prince Hall Masonic Temple in Indianapolis, and that's why we've carried over this to our 2024 10 Most Endangered list. We're honored to have Dr. William D. Moore, author of Masonic Temples, Freemasonry, Ritual Architecture, and Masculine Archetypes, to discuss the architectural legacy of Masons. And we've got his book for sale, and we'll have a signing after the talk. Dr. Moore holds a joint appointment at Boston University between the Department of History and Art and Architecture and the American and New England Studies program. An interdisciplinary American Studies scholar, he has specialties in material culture, the built environment, and cultural history. He holds an A.B. in folklore and mythology from Harvard University and an M.A. and a Ph.D. from the American and New England Studies program at Boston University. He researches, lectures, and publishes on vernacular architecture, folk art, American fraternalism, public history, the interpretation of historic sites, and the history of surfing. And we're going to bring you back in the summer, I think, for that talk. In addition to his book on Freemasonry, he is the author of Shaker Fever, America's 20th Century Fascination with a Communitarian Sect, and contributor of numerous articles, exhibition catalogs, books, and scholarly journals. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journals of Winter Portfolio and Buildings and Landscapes. Earlier in his career, he served as the director of the Livingston Masonic Library and Museum at the Masonic Grand Lodge of New York in New York City. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to get to chat with you about something that I've been obsessed with for 30 years now. So my challenge today was to make sense of buildings like this one, the Prince Hall Masonic Grand Lodge, built in 1916 for Oriental Lodge number 500. A building that is rightfully, I believe, on the most threatened list for Indiana landmarks. So to help you understand this, to help you think about this building the way I do, I think it's always useful to give you a little bit of an overview, and I hope this list doesn't look too long. What I'm going to talk about today is the pre-modern roots of Freemasonry and the Solomonic ritual that defines the brotherhood, and then how that gets manifested into a ritual space, the lodge room. And then the lodge room is the defining characteristic of a Masonic temple. So how that Solomonic ritual and the lodge room then gets manifested in the architecture of lodge rooms. And then I'm going to talk about the other spaces that get put into these temples for other aspects of the fraternity at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So very quickly, we're going to talk about the Knights Templar, the Scottish Rite, and their transformation of the ritual into theater, and then Shriners' mosques and the development of the ancient Arabic order of the nobles or the mystic shrine. And then I'm gonna wrap up by talking about the preservation challenges that face us with these buildings. So what is Freemasonry and where does it come from? It's a brotherhood, and for much of the world, it's a purely male brotherhood that developed in the British Isles sometime between 1300 and 1600. And you know, that there's no quicker way to get into an argument with a Masonic scholar than to say that the first Masonic lodge, as we understand it, started at this particular date. But at some point, the rituals and the practices of operative stonemasons got transformed and passed over to gentlemen who wanted to join their lodges. And they went from being operative masons to speculative masons, meaning that they talked about buildings rather than actually building buildings. And, you know, and that's all linked in many ways to the Reformation and the Rosicrucians, but that's a talk for another night. The important thing to remember is that starting about 1717, we know that there were gentlemen who were meeting in Masonic lodges, and they were no longer masons themselves, stonemasons. They were now operative masons. And in 1717 in London, 4 of these lodges got together to form the first Grand Lodge, a cooperation between the 4 different lodges in London. And in 1723, they published the first book of Freemasonry, which you see here, the Constitutions. And from the beginning, they were linked to the British Royal House. So there's always been something about Freemasonry and British royalty and the aristocracy that has kept it going. So, but from the very beginning, the rituals that were defining the brotherhood were linked to the idea of building Solomon's temple. And the Masons see themselves as the descendants of the people that built Solomon's temple. Now, I'm also going to tell you that I'm not a Freemason, so I'm not giving away any secrets here. I'm just talking, you know, there's going to be no secrets given away tonight. I'm just telling you what's in the written record, right? So the rituals that they got from the operative Masons, and which they then turned into their speculative rituals, all talked about ethics and morality, using the symbols of architecture, using the symbols of construction, and again, centered on the building of Solomon's temple, right? And if there's one thing I want you to remember from this lecture as we leave, is that Solomon's temple is the central image, and to understand the Masonic temples, you need to understand Solomon's temple, right? So here in this image, we've got King Solomon, we've got his friend Hiram, the king of Tyre, who was the contractor for Solomon's temple, and here you've got Hiram Abiff, who is a character out of the Bible who was the architect who designed Solomon's temple, right? So these are called the ancient grand masters. And here you've also got symbols of Solomon's temple, which I'm going to want you to continue to keep in your mind as we go forward. These are the pillars on the porch of Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz, which are used as symbols of the temple. And then the tessellated pavement here, that's the floor of the Sanctum Sanctorum of Solomon's temple. And then the 3 great lights, or the 3 lesser lights, actually. So this is a symbol of Solomon's temple, and there's Solomon himself, all the way back to 1750. So as I mentioned, it's tied to the aristocracy. It's gentlemen educating themselves about the Enlightenment, about self-government in a time before democracy, in these lodges that are meeting And the lodges are simply groups of men that get together, and mostly what they do is initiate other members of the community into the fraternity, right? So the central activity of a Masonic lodge is initiating people and teaching them the morality, the ethics, the symbolism of the fraternity. So this is an 18th century engraving from France, because it crossed over the channel, showing what an 18th century initiation ceremony looks like. And here is the poor hoodwinked initiate coming in, and here's the master of the lodge sitting with his hat on. The hat is a symbol of the master of the lodge, and they are bringing him to show him this painting, which is on the floor, which is called a floor cloth or a tracing board, which has the symbols of the fraternity on it, so that when they take the blindfold off, the hoodwink off, they can explain what's on the floor cloth and teach them this is what it means to be a Mason. And notice again, there's the tessellated pavement, there's the Jachin and Boaz, right? And again, symbols like the square and the level that are used to teach ideas about morality. And I also want to call your attention to this symbol that's painted on the floor cloth, which is a rope called a cable tow. And a cable tow is about the binding of brotherhood and your responsibilities to the other members of the fraternity, right? So this is mid 18th century initiation. This is showing kind of the practices of the gentlemen. And you can see already they're wearing aprons to show that they're Freemasons. But also notice that these are elite upper class men. So as I said, it spreads from London, from England, and it travels with the colonial forces of the British Empire. And so here is 1735, an engraved chart, which shows from 4 lodges in 1717, by 1735, you've got all of these different lodges. This is a chart of the expansion of the lodges that are recognized by the Grand Lodge of England, including with colonists coming across the Atlantic, you start to have lodges in North America, right? So number 126 in this chart is the first North American lodge in Boston. And that's not because I'm a Bostonian, that's just historical fact. So in the organization, which had originally been called the Free and Accepted Masons, there's a schism back in London where you've got people that are saying, you guys aren't doing it right. We're gonna claim that we're the older organization and we're gonna reform the group. And they call themselves the ancient Free and Accepted Masons, even though they're the newer group, right? It's a little bit confusing, I know, but the ancients are the newer group, right? And the Free and Accepted Masons had tended to be people who were at the various highest levels of society, the elites, and the ancient Free and Accepted Masons were letting in people who were artisans, who were still perfectly respectable, but they weren't the aristocracy, right? And in the United States, that starts to bring in people like Paul Revere, people like Ben Franklin, right, who'd been a printer's apprentice, right? And Freemasonry becomes a way to claim gentility in the colonies for these artisans, right? And so you've got Free and Accepted Mason lodges, which are kind of gentlemen's playthings, but the ancient Free and Accepted Masons take it very seriously, and they start to educate themselves, right? Because they want to become genteel. And through this, they spread through first the port cities and then into the backwoods, the ideas of the Enlightenment. And when I say the backwoods, I mean like Western Massachusetts and Richmond, right? That's the backwoods, right? Not the coastal cities, right? And they do it using these floor cloths. And these are floor cloths from the late 18th, beginning of the 19th century, from the United States. These two examples are actually from New York State. And notice again, Yachin and Boaz. Whoop. Yachin and Boaz here, Yachin and Boaz here, right? The tessellated pavement, the tessellated pavement. And I want to call attention to these two symbols. This is the rough ashlar. This is a man coming straight from the quarry, his natural identity. And this is a man after Freemasonry, where he's got flat surfaces and right angles. You can't build a temple using this boulder, but after they've gone through the initiation, after they've learned how to regulate their emotions and how to work in a democracy, they are thus a perfect ashlar who can build Solomon's temple. They're a member of society, okay? Now, I know I'm going fast, and there's a lot more to answer here. I hope you'll stick with me and ask questions at the end, right? So, in this time period, as I said, it's spreading. People are learning the Enlightenment ideas. They're learning about self-government. They're learning about democracy. They're learning about self-regulation. And this brotherhood attracts a broad range of people, including George Washington. And this is an image of George Washington taken from life by a portrait painter, William Williams, right? Showing him in his regalia. And again, so this is not a copy after Gilbert Stuart. This is not a made up image. This is George Washington in his actual regalia. And he used his regalia to lay the cornerstone of the US Capitol using Masonic rituals, right? So you've got George Washington, a member of the planter class who sees value in Freemasonry. And then you also have an 18th century African-American Methodist preacher from Boston named Prince Hall, who is admitted into the fraternity. And he's admitted into the fraternity by, here we have British Empire again, by a lodge that is traveling with a regiment that's part of the occupation of Boston before the Revolution. And the British soldiers don't have the same racial attitudes that the American colonists have. So they're willing to initiate an African American into the lodge. Prince Hall, after he gets initiated, has some of his African American colleagues initiated, and they end up having their own lodge called African Lodge Number 3, which gets chartered from the Grand Lodge of England. But after the Revolution, the white Masons refused to recognize their regularity and their legitimacy. So Prince Hall and his lodge brothers set up a standard here American racist issue, a separate Masonic structure that is basically the same, except one's white and one's black, right? So part of this whole idea of American colonists, free, white and black, seeing value in Freemasonry. Whoop, wrong way. So after the Revolution, these lodge meetings are held in temporary spaces, usually in taverns, in coffee houses, and in the houses of the lodge master. So this is a building from Western Massachusetts. It's called the Salem Townhouse because that's the name of the man that built it. It's not the Salem Townhouse, it's the Salem Town House. And here in the second floor, this is a Masonic ritual space that has the same symbols of the all-seeing eye and the stars on the ceiling. And then these are the tall cedars of Lebanon that were cut down to build the temple, right? Painted into the plaster. And so this is what lodge rooms looked like in the early national period. It's now at Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, which again is kind of near Worcester. And possibly the most elegant lodge building of this time period is here in Aurora, New York, which is in the Finger Lakes district, Scipio Lodge number 110, that was built in 1820 and had the cornerstone laid by DeWitt Clinton, who was very active in New York Freemasonry, as well as being the governor of New York and central to the building of the Erie Canal, right? Again, bringing civilization to the colony. And you can notice that along with all of the wonderful neoclassical architecture and the federal period baluster across the top and the fans and the urn, the turned urn. So it's got all of this federal period stuff going on. But notice also you still have Yachin and Boaz on the front to show that it's Solomon's temple. And then this building also indicates that the rituals of Freemasonry, which had started out as being only 3 degrees, have now expanded. So you've got what were called the Royal Arch degrees that were about not the building of Solomon's temple, but the rebuilding of Solomon's temple later, right? And so here's the Royal Arch with the keystone that shows that there's more than 3 rituals being presented in this building. So in this time, Freemasonry became kind of a central piece of American civil religion. And again, I mentioned George Washington laid the cornerstone, right? And anybody that wanted to have a place in public life became a Freemason, that it was a way to be present if you wanted to be elected to the state senator, so forth. And in the 1820s, as American society changed, and as you also had Jacksonian democracy, you had at the same time that you had the Second Great Awakening. These forces came together to create what's called the anti-masonic period, in which activists almost drove Freemasonry out of business. Activists that believed that Freemasonry was a conspiracy to bring on an American aristocracy. It was a conspiracy by the Illuminati from Germany to take over the government. At the same time that Christians started to be worried that Freemasonry was universal, so that you didn't have to be a Christian to join. You could be Jewish, you could be Muslim and still be a brother, and the evangelical Christians didn't like that. So this is a piece of the anti-Masonic propaganda from the 1830s, which I love because it ridicules the Masonic rituals. Notice here that the poor candidate is not just blindfolded, but has the cable tow wrapped around his neck, right? And he's about to be hit over the head with a mallet by the worshipful master who's wearing a hat. And you'll notice that instead of being in a grand space that looks like Solomon's temple, they're up in the attic of a building where you've got rats running around, right? So who would want to join a fraternity where you're going to get hit over the head by a mallet while there are rats in the background, right? So this almost drives Freemasonry out of business in the 1830s and 1840s. But it comes back, and when it comes back, there's been work done that kind of standardizes the Masonic ritual and gives it a standard architectural spatial form. So in the antebellum period, in the period immediately before the Civil War, you get the formalization of the lodge room, which is, this has been a long wind up to explaining the lodge room. And here's the lodge room as it takes place just before the Civil War, with the master of the lodge, notice he's got a hat on again, up a set of 3 steps with a G over his head, right? And here's the other officers of the lodge around the altar in the center, right? And you've got 2 rooms here to come in, one for the candidate and one for the regular members to come in. And notice it's up a set of stairs. It's supposed to be on the 2nd floor, right? And the reason that the space in the center of the lodge room is open is because that's where the floor work takes place. And the floor work is the ritual enactment of a legend about activities at the building of Solomon's temple, right? And once again, the worshipful master here plays the role of King Solomon, and this space is supposed to be the sanctum sanctorum of Solomon's temple, right? And lo and behold, the anti-Masons weren't making it up. A central piece of the ritual is the initiate being hit over the head with a mallet and killed, right? And I'm not going to tell you the ritual, the rest of it. You got to go figure that out yourself. But it culminates with the the initiate, kneeling at the altar and taking the oath of a master mason. And notice again, some things continue. There's the hoodwink, there's the cable tow, right? That these are actual parts of the ritual that are taking place in the lodge room, which is always a mythic understanding of Solomon's temple. So, I told you this is happening just before the Civil War. The Civil War interrupts everything. But then after the Civil War, American society changes in a couple of ways, right? And these are changes that you all already know about. It's industrialization, it's transportation, and suddenly there's what historians have called the Great Deflation, which means that because of industrialization, because of mass production, because of standardized interchangeable parts, suddenly Americans can own more things. They all have more money to spend. But at the same time, American society is becoming more atomized and people are moving, and it's going from being an agricultural nation to an urban nation. And both of these things come together to create what is called the golden age of fraternity. That society is so tumultuous, people have been torn from what they grew up with, the world's changing around them, and they gather together into fraternities to find a bearing on the shifting sands of American society. So these two things coming together, people looking for stability and having more money, means that all across the nation, you get lodge rooms built in fashions that you wouldn't have seen beforehand. Instead of just having a space over the tavern or over the general store on Main Street, you start to get, these are two examples from big cities, the 1873 New York City Masonic Temple, and here on the right, the Egyptian Hall and the Philadelphia Masonic Temple that was decorated by George Herzog, who is the most highest status interior decorator that was decorating the mansions of all the Philadelphians on the main line, who got the commission to decorate the Masonic Temple in downtown Philadelphia. And here's, probably the finest example. There were 6 or 7 lodge rooms in this building, and this one he decorated in the Egyptian to kind of refer back to the fact that Freemasons are an ancient brotherhood going back to Solomon's Temple. And if you go to Philadelphia, you should definitely put on your list, tour the Philadelphia Masonic Temple. It's open every day. It's worth seeing. If you just like Victorian stuff, it's fabulous. So this lodge room becomes the standard thing that every lodge has to have. And as I said, many of them are just built on top of stores, banks, theaters on main streets all over the country. But again, Solomon as the worshipful master sitting in the throne at the east end of the lodge, right? And again, they're supposed to be interchangeable. Every time you do the Masonic ritual, wherever you happen to be in the nation, you're supposed to be in the same ritual space. So here you go. This is the lodge room inside that same Prince Hall Masonic Grand Lodge, Oriental Lodge number 500, right? Because every time you go into the room, you're supposed to be in the same the same ritual space, no matter where you are in the country. All right, so Solomon's Temple becomes the central metaphor. And as they're doing the ritual, the Masons take the ritual very seriously. And again, I told you the Great Deflation, they've got money to spend. Over time, at the end of the 19th century, rather than doing it in business clothes, they say, well, if we want people to think it's Solomon's Temple, we should be dressed like Solomon, right? And there are industries all throughout the country, particularly in Michigan and Illinois, that are willing to sell you regalia. right? So all across the United States in the 19th century, you've got men dressed up in this fantastic regalia to put on these rituals, right? And once again, here's the master of the lodge dressed as Solomon. Here's Hiram, king of Tyre, and here's Hiram Abiff, right? The three grand masters. And you can buy it in any color you want, you know, and you can spend as much or as little on these regalias as you want, you know. So a lot of men love this idea of being the biblical patriarch. And Solomon's temple becomes expressed not just in the lodge room, but all across the country. You will find lodge rooms, buildings that are expressing this idea of Solomon's temple on the outside, right? So this is, I went too far. This is in Arkansas, El Dorado, Arkansas, built in the 1920s. And you can see, once again, there's the Achin and Boaz on the front, right? And again, you're paying for the building by having rental space on the first couple floors, but on the second floors, you've got your ritual spaces, you've got your club spaces, and you can show that you are part of this brotherhood, which there's a linkage here, right, between Solomon and the ancient Jews and being God's chosen people, and America being God's chosen people in the 19th century, right? And the Solomon's temple being in every town is showing that we are a righteous people and we are actually God's chosen people, right? So in the 1920s, during the period of great economic prosperity, you end up getting Solomon's Temple like this one in St. Louis, right? With this wonderful ziggurat roof. And again, Yachin and Boaz here with the Egyptoid columns on the front. You can see that this one currently is the building for Scientology. They knew a good building when they saw it. And then I love this one on the left also, which is these are both in St. Louis. Again, the one on the left is designed by a German immigrant architect who was a Mason, with these wonderful obelisks on the front and the pharaonic masks up in the corners here. This one's now an African-American church. But again, Masonic buildings as Solomon's Temple. And here we have the Masonic Temple built in Muncie, Indiana. And here's the mural showing Solomon's Temple and Solomon on the interior, so that we know that people in Muncie are part of God's chosen people as well. So this idea of Solomon bleeds out of the Masonic temples into American popular culture. In this time period, in the beginning of the 20th century, Ringling Brothers, and all of the Ringling Brothers were Masons, were touring spectacle circuses around the country that were Solomon and the King of Sheba, and they were buying their costumes from the Masonic regalia companies, right? And Masons had enough money that they could buy things from the finest providers. So here are stained glass windows of Solomon produced by Tiffany Studios in New York. And the one on the left is a memorial to Edward J. Simmons, who was the Grand Master of Masons for the state of New York, but also was the head of the New York Chamber of Commerce and the New York Stock Exchange, right? And his lodge, the money wasn't really a problem for them. So they bought this memorial window for Tiffany to memorialize him in the chapel at the Masonic home in Utica, New York. And Tiffany, being a business as well as being an art producer, used that same cartoon for the stained glass window in multiple others. So here's an example that from 15 years later that they installed in the mausoleum in Mayfield, Ohio, outside Cleveland. My favorite King Solomon reference is this mausoleum in Kansas City, Mount Moriah Cemetery. This was a cemetery that was put together where you had to be a Mason to be able to buy into it. So you could spend eternity with your fraternal brothers. And if you wanted to, you could spend eternity in a mausoleum that was meant to be Solomon's temple, right? And as well as that, they also on the interior included a lodge room. So the lodges, when they did their funerals for their brothers, could do it in a space that was meant to be Solomon's temple, the sanctum sanctorum, inside the temple, inside the cemetery, right? And I just love this. This is Russell Stover of the chocolate company, and he's buried here in Mount Moriah Mausoleum. All right, so that is kind of the lodge room and Solomon and masonry, the 3 Blue Lodge degrees. But over time, there were a number of other sets of rituals that were developed to feed the American men's desire for rituals. So other Masonic bodies developed that had other identities. And the first of these was the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar, again, came out of French Freemasonry, and the French didn't like the fact that Freemasonry was about being an artisan or a workman. The French thought that there should be some kind of aristocracy or knighthood that went along with being a Mason. So they developed the story that Freemasonry, that the builders of Solomon's Temple taught the secret rituals to the knights that went to free Jerusalem in the Crusades, and that the secret rituals of Solomon's Temple were brought back to Europe by the Knights Templar. So starting in the antebellum period, you had Americans that were building upon this French story to claim that they were not just Masons, but they were also Knights Templar, right? And here you see a 19th century image showing the ancient costumes and the modern costumes of the Knights Templar, and an antebellum Masonic ritual book showing how to do sword play. If you're going to be a knight, you need to know how to do sword play. So they're not only just learning how to be Masons, now they're learning how to be knights as well. And in the post-Civil War period, as Americans dealt with the aftermath of the Civil War, many American men liked what they had experienced in the war. They liked the brotherhood of being in the military. They liked the idea of close drilling, of the discipline of the military, and they created their own Knights Templar commanderies that practiced this kind of drilling. And at the same time, they saw themselves as being the righteous defenders of Solomon's Temple, the righteous defenders of Christianity, the righteous defenders of God's chosen people. And so they needed to have spaces in the buildings that were being built for the Masons as well. And so they had 2 different spaces, armories and drill halls. Armories are just the places where they kept their uniforms and their swords. And these are the most difficult to document because they were basically locker rooms and nobody took photographs of them. And also when the Knights Templar kind of went out of business or declined, the Masonic Hall associations would take the lockers out and just use them as storage space, right? So these historic armories are very difficult to document, but in this floor plan of a Masonic temple from the 1920s, you can see there's this exterior passage and lockers all the way around. And those lockers are where the Knights Templar would store their uniforms. And in this floor plan of a Masonic temple from 1874, this is the second story of the 2-story lodge room. And then here is the Knights Templar drill hall where they could practice their close marching. And back to Muncie, here's the commandery room in the Masonic temple in Muncie. Again, so that the Knights Templars could put their uniforms and practice drilling in private so that they could then go out and perform in parades and in competitions. So Blue Lodge, Knights Templar. The third set of rituals are the Scottish Rite rituals. And the Scottish Rite rituals come out of a revived interest in ancient wisdom and esoteric knowledge that was happening in France that comes into the United States first through South Carolina, through Charleston, but then spreads out, and instead of rituals, they end up having 33 rituals, 33 different sets of rituals and 33 different sets of texts, right? And what that means is that the Masonic lodge rooms end up having lots and lots of different kinds of paraphernalia, as you see in this engraving of a Scottish Rite space from 1870. Note again the worshipful master off there in the east, right? And here's a set showing all the knights from the Scottish Rite degree team in New York City in the 1870s. And putting on these rituals was very, took a lot of gear. It was very, it took a lot of effort by the members of the fraternity, the members of the Scottish Rite bodies. So they tended to only be regional rather than the Blue Lodges and the Knights Templar. Every town had one. The Scottish Rite bodies were only kind of in the biggest population centers. And starting about 1890, they realized that they were actually much better if instead of doing it in a lodge room, they used theatrical backdrops, right? Like this one or like that one, to represent not just Solomon's Temple, but also the catacombs underneath Solomon's Temple, a cave, the ford and a river, almost even down to Hades. There are backdrops that show Hades, right? To go with all of the different messages being taught by these 33 different rituals, right? And they also realized that if we're going to go to all this effort to put these rituals on, it's not cost effective to only initiate one person at a time. Let's initiate 50 men at a time, or 100 men at a time, or 150 men at a time. And suddenly, if you're letting that many people in and you're getting initiation dues from them, you're starting to talk about real money, right? And if you're talking, and also, so they're able to build bigger and bigger buildings to have their Scottish Rite scenery. All right, and here's a couple other examples. This is an image of Solomon's Temple in the Kansas City, Missouri Scottish Rite Temple. And again, there's a push and pull between the rituals and the men that are supplying the goods for the rituals. So this is a salesman sample of from Sossman and Landis, which was a scenic design firm based in Minneapolis, where they would come and say, you know, if you want to spend that much, I can give you Solomon's Temple here in this scenery. And isn't that much better than what you can do in your own lodge room, right? And so they get bigger and bigger. And by the time the 1920s come along, they're creating auditoriums that seat 3,000 people. Right? So again, 3,000 people at a time, all paying $150 in dues, right? You've paid off the building after 2 years, right? And again, people from all over eastern Missouri are coming in to go through the rituals over 4 days and to party with their buddies and to get the extra status boost you get from being a 32nd degree Mason. And possibly the most impressive and largest Scottish Rite temple ever built is right here, right? Finished in 1929. And part of the unfortunate story of all this is that these fraternal organizations keep building temples starting in 1870s. They outgrow them and then they build another one, and they outgrow them and they outgrow that one. So by 1927, they've already outgrown 2 buildings. And they're thinking, well, we need to plan for the future. We need to, this expansion that's been going on for 50 years is going to continue, right? So we're not going to build for what we need today. We're going to build for what we need 10 years down the line without recognizing that the Depression is coming, right? And then in 1929, the whole world changes. And many of these buildings are lost immediately because they've leveraged them too far out. Indianapolis this does not happen to, but many buildings across the country, they're lost immediately. So Blue Lodge, Knights Templar, Scottish Rite, and then the final one are the Shriners. The Shriners are founded in 1870 in New York City, and rather than taking the Judeo-Christian tradition as their motif, they pretend that they are from the Islamic world, from the Middle East. And again, 1870 New York, they don't know anything about the Middle East. They don't know anything about the Islamic world. They just have seen pretty pictures and engravings and so forth. So they're pretending to be people that they don't understand, but they know that they're not bound by Judeo-Christian. But when they're pretending to be Shriners, they're not bound by the tenets of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So they think they can drink, which is ridiculous, right? Because Islam doesn't let you, forbids alcohol. They think that they're living in a world of dancing girls. They like Turkish tobacco, right? There's all sorts of consumption that's going on that's rejecting everything that they've learned in Masonry, right? And so they start to build their own buildings that are Shriners' mosques. And you'll notice here in this floor plan of Kismet Temple in Brooklyn, it's basically a lodge room, except it's much bigger with a stage. And at the same time that they're building these places as playgrounds, as places where they can go and smoke cigarettes and smoke cigars and tell jokes with their friends, they're also thinking about providing auditoriums to the towns that they live in. So they're wealthy people, because to be a Shriner, you already need to be paying the dues for your Blue Lodge. You need to be paying the dues for either the Scottish Rite or the Knights Templar. And then you have to pay your Shriner's dues. So there's an economic barrier to entry to being a Shriner in this time period, right? And they think that they're being good citizens by providing facilities to their own cities, right? So they build these amazing buildings. Here's a couple from Indiana, which you might recognize, that again are clubhouses which allow them to drink and smoke. And also they have these fabulous interiors that are showing off their wealth, showing off their sophistication. At the same time, they also show that they don't really understand that there's a difference between ancient Egypt and, the Islamic world, right? They're all just fantasy. It might as well be Mars, right? So what that means is that all across the country, we have these buildings that were built for very specific purposes, specific rituals that are being practiced in that time period between 1870 and the Depression. That's when these buildings are being built. Now, American society in the present is very different from American society in that time. So the purposes that these buildings were built for have long left. What is it you want to blame it on? Is it television? Is it two income families where, after you come home? Is it changes in sex roles, changes in marriage, that men aren't going off 8 hours a day after work and leaving their wives at home? What are the things you want to blame for the fact that nobody's inhabiting these lodge rooms anymore? But what it means is that these buildings, which many of them are spectacular, and you can tell that I love them, they're abandoned and they're trouble, right? So this one on the left, the Lincoln Masonic Temple in Aurora, Illinois, the Masons moved out. They couldn't afford to maintain it anymore. For a while, somebody tried to use it as a function room and have parties and weddings and so forth in it, but they found that there wasn't enough money coming in, so the roof leaked and there was water damage all throughout it, so it was no longer someplace that people wanted to go. The people that were using it as a function hall moved out, and in 2019, it burned to the ground, right? And again, it's got all sorts of wooden furniture. It's got all sorts of textiles. It was gutted, right? This picture on the right, I took last week when I was in Macon, Georgia. It's a spectacular Art Deco Moorish Revival, Scottish Shrine Mosque, and you can see that the doors are plywood, right? And once again, the shrine moved out. There wasn't enough parking downtown. They didn't like downtown. They moved out into the suburbs. Somebody tried to use it as a function hall. Right now, it's got homeless people living in it, and it's only a matter of time till it burns and goes away, right? Now, so that we're not ending on too much of a bummer, I will tell you that sometimes there are people that find another use for the building. So this is Jerusalem Shrine Temple in New Orleans, completed in 1918, and a non-denominational evangelical church has purchased it, and they're putting $15 million into rehabbing it for their Christian worship purposes. And here I am inside the auditorium, which you can see is just another big lodge room with a stage, right? And has been allowed to have water damage, and thank God the church is coming in to fix it. The problem is that the evangelical church is very uncomfortable with the Moorish Revival decorations and the Shriners' images on it. And they keep calling me and say, you know, the Historic Preservation Commission really doesn't like the fact that we're taking the scimitar off the building. And I'd say, well, I think that's probably right, you know. And notice it's called Jerusalem Temple, right? So I keep trying to tell them, you know, this fits in with your motif, right? It's about, you know, this is where God, this is where the Son of God was in the Middle East, and the camels going across the door here, right? That's like the flight from Jerusalem, right? The flight out of Egypt. I don't know what's going to happen, but at least the building is going to still be standing. All right, so I've done it, right? Pre-modern roots, Solomon. Remember, every time you look at a Masonic temple, I want you to think about King Solomon, right? That this is about Americans being King Solomon. And then you got lodge rooms, the Knights Templar, the Scottish Rite, the Shriners' mosques. And what are we going to do with these buildings? I wish I knew. I mean, it's all about keeping a roof on them, keeping a new economic use for them so that they'll continue to stay. And they are an extraordinarily important part of our American architectural heritage. And thank you for your close attention. Okay, so I promised you that I would answer questions. Okay, they're in the back.
So I'm curious about Prince Hall and any restrictions on its use, or just the idea that it needs preservation in the sense of making sure the roof doesn't leak?
Okay, I'm a stranger here.
Well,
That's a question. I mean, the restrictions on its use are local legislation, local issues, and I'm not qualified to answer that. You know,
Okay.
once they've, you know, that was a Masonic temple owned by one of the white Masonic lodges. When they were no longer maintaining it, they sold it, and it went from being a lodge to being a grand lodge, which means that they've got a bigger group of people that are contributing to supporting it. Now the Prince Hall Grand Lodge can't afford to maintain it. So I don't, you know, within Masonic circles, there's no restriction. They've sold it off as property. As far as what the city of Indianapolis has restrictions on it, you know, as far as zoning or preservation covenants or anything, I don't know about that.
Thank you.
Okay, you got a question? Wait for the microphone.
Where was Solomon's temple?
Solomon's temple is in Jerusalem, right?
And it's still ruins?
No, no, no. It's the most holy space for both Islam and Judaism. And it's in many ways, you could argue that fighting over that site is part of what's going on in the Middle East right now, is who gets to control the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock is located. So Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem is not only important for Freemasonry, it's important for all of the Abrahamic religions and Western civilization. Got a question here. Oh,
I was just gonna say, do you feel like the temples or the lodges that went out to the suburbs, that they were able to be sustained any better than the city ones, or how are those lodges doing in comparison to the inner city?
well, a lot of the white Masonic lodges participated in what historians call the crisis of the cities in the 1960s, when American society was building highways and de-investing in the cities. And the middle-class white men that were in the lodges, they had already moved out to the suburbs, and they didn't want to drive in and leave their cars in the inner city. So many of the lodges sold their temples and built lesser temples out in the suburbs in the 1960s. But that did not save them from the other sociological and demographic waves that were coming later, like I mentioned, two-income families and television and the internet and staying up late arguing on the internet. All these things that men spend their time on now that they didn't spend their time in this time period. So many of those buildings that were built in the 1960s or 1970s, which I say are lesser buildings, are also being lost over time. Oh, right. So from the 18th century, there's been trouble between the Catholic Church and the Freemasons. And depending on who you ask, you know, it's that the more conservative popes in the Catholic Church see it as a you know, I started by talking about how it's spreading the Enlightenment, right? And the Catholic Church in the 18th and 19th century thought the Enlightenment was a bad idea, right? That it was about deism and not about the structure of the church. And also, you took an oath of secrecy when you joined the Masonic Lodge, and that goes against the Catholic practice of confession, right? That you're supposed to be able to tell everything to the priest, and if you've taken an oath of secrecy, you can't tell everything to the priest. So the Catholic Church for a long time was excommunicating Freemasons. Now that doesn't mean that Catholics didn't join Freemasonry; they just didn't tell the church that they were joining Freemasonry. And ultimately, in the 1880s, as Freemasonry is taking off in this time period, Father McGivney in New Haven, Connecticut, comes up with the Knights of Columbus, which is serving in many ways the same purpose that the Masons are, which no Knights of Columbus will tell you that. They'll say, oh, no, we're a Catholic brotherhood. We're not just an imitation of the Masons, but in many ways, as a historian, I have to say they're an imitation of the Masons. So the Knights of Columbus takes on that role for the Masons, for the Catholics who wanted to be in a fraternal organization but couldn't join the Masons. Did you have another question from Zoom?
Were the original cemeteries, were they open to the families of Masons, or were they only males that were allowed?
So there's a lot, I mean, all right. So what I'm going to say that Freemasonry as a global brotherhood is such that anything you say about Masons, somebody else is going to be able to come up with an example that disproves what you're answering, right? But what I'm going to say is there's two different kinds of Masonic cemeteries, right? There are some cemeteries where the lodge owns the plot of ground, right? And if somebody in the lodge that doesn't have any place else to get buried, the lodge will bury them in that plot of ground. And so that's only for the members of the lodge. But on a larger picture, there are many Masonic cemeteries where Masons buy into it and buy enough ground that they can bury their entire families, right? And I was just talking, I was just talking with Heather Calloway down at Indiana University. And the other thing is that that I didn't talk about at all, because I was just talking about architecture, is that starting in the 1850s, the Masons and the Oddfellows and the other fraternities start to build homes for aged Masons, sick Masons, their widows, right? And what's amazing to me there is many of these homes have now, with the welfare state, with Social Security, with all that stuff, the purpose of these compounds have disappeared. But you go to you go to these old homes, and on the edges of the property, there's all the widows of the Masons that are lined up, you know, in the cemeteries. You know, after their husband died, nobody was there to support them. They moved into the fraternity's care center, and they lived their lives out until they died and got buried. And they've got community there in eternity, just like in Solomon's Temple outside Kansas City. So that was a long-winded answer to say it depends. Depends on what kind of cemetery you're talking about. Back here. Oh. So the question was, what about Victorian obelisks in cemeteries in the Midwest? And are those linked to Masons? I don't think they are. I think that's a different pattern of, and here's where my American Studies scholar hat gets put on. Starting in the 1830s, you had a movement called the Garden Cemetery movement that starts in again, as a Bostonian, I'm embarrassed to say, starts in Boston. And suddenly, instead of burying people in churchyards, they start to have gardens with curvilinear streets, and you're supposed to be able to commune with nature, right? And they move them out from the city centers out into the countryside. And with that, there's also a reinterest in the classical past. And it's also part of an individualization that cemeteries are now much more about celebrating an individual rather than celebrating, you know, this church or that denomination. So the obelisks, I think, are about the garden cemetery movement and about putting more emphasis on the individual by giving them a bigger marker throughout the middle of the 19th century. And I don't think that's Freemasonry. Oh, right. Oh, I forgot my last slide. I forgot my last slide. There's my last slide.
Been waiting for a while. Thank you so much for your talk, and especially for the lovely photographs of the different architecture associated with Masonry, especially the Scottish Rite Temple in Indianapolis. I'd never been inside of that, so thank you for showing that. What I wanted to ask about, I was struck by the persistence of mentions of hoods. You mentioned hoodwinked several times, and you also pointed out images of hoods in the different photographs that you have shown throughout the talk. And of course, the hood is associated with the KKK as well. And I was just wondering, is there any type of relationship between the KKK or crossover, et cetera, and Masonry? Thank you for your talk.
So it's a very complex question, right? Now, but when I'm talking about hoodwinks, that's just a name for having a blindfold on. And part of that blindfold thing is just that you're in darkness and then suddenly you're in light, and it makes an emotional impact on you. Okay, for the bigger picture of Freemasonry and the KKK, in the 19th century, fraternalism, I told you, the golden age of fraternalism. Fraternalism was kind of the basic way in which groups of people, particularly groups of men, would structure a society. So when they started a group, they would say, okay, we want this group to provide benefits to laborers, right? So the first union was the Knights of Labor, right? And again, knight, right? So they took a fraternal model. So when you've got racists after the Civil War who want to set up a fraternity that supports white supremacy, they take a fraternal model. They call themselves the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so, and because Freemasonry was so pervasive in American society, there were a number of people who were Masons who also were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And then again in the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan revives itself and is anti-immigrant, they're kind of the Proud Boys of the 1920s, you know, once again, there's a lot of people who are pro-Christian. They want to, you know, in our language of today, I kind of referred to this with the Knights Templar, that there's an idea of Christian nationalism that goes along with that. So there's the Ku Klux Klan found some recruiting success in going to Masonic lodges and saying, you know, this is just more of the same that you're already doing. Don't you want to join us, you know, to keep America Christian, to keep America white, you know? So I don't want to be an apologist, you know. There were Masons who became members of the Ku Klux Klan, but not all Masons, and certainly the Masonic ritual, which teaches about the equality of individuals and the importance of individual conscious and working towards what the grand architect of the universe wants. You know, there's nothing inherent in there that's going to turn somebody into a member of the KKK. So I don't think it's inherent in the organization, but I think that the Ku Klux Klan, particularly in the 1920s, was able to use both Masonic ritual structures and also the men who were thinking about how to keep America from changing to build an important structure. Is that fair enough? Did I thread that needle? One last.
If there is a lodge called Prince Hall, does it always have an African-American connection?
Yes, that's the short answer. The long answer is, I've already talked to you about a number of schisms, the schisms between the ancients and the moderns, and the schism between the mainstream white Masons and the Prince Hall Masons, right? So Prince Hall Masons, they frequently call it now Prince Hall affiliation. So Mount Moriah Lodge number 222, Prince Hall affiliation, right? Having said that, the African-American or the Black Masonic community has had multiple schisms within itself. So all Prince Hall Mason lodges tend to be historically Black, but not all Black historically Masons are Prince Hall affiliation. So for example, in Brooklyn, New York, the last time I counted, there were 8 different Masonic Black Grand Lodges in the city of Brooklyn alone. So.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm
Thank
so
you.
sorry that we don't have time. And
I am going to be signing books out in the lobby if you'd like to buy my book.
yeah, I'm gonna run out there and start selling the books. And thank you again to all of our members. And if you're not a member of Indiana Landmarks, we would love to have you support us and help us save meaningful places like a lot of these lodges. So thank you very much for coming.